The sun had barely begun to dip beneath the horizon when 4 outlaw figures slithered into the dusty town of Sagebrush, Arizona. Led by the notorious gunman named Jack the Devil Creed, they'd heard the rumors about a widow who owned a saloon in town. A quiet, seemingly innocent woman who, for reasons unknown, had never been seen without a pistol strapped to her side. What they didn't know, though, was that those rumors were nothing compared to the truth. Her name was Clara Sharpshot O'Donnell, and she was known in every town west of the Mississippi for her deadly aim and cold demeanor. No man, woman, or child in Sagebrush dared challenge her, and for good reason. But when these 4 criminals decided to cross the line, the consequences would be swift. They would soon learn that crossing paths with the legendary sharpshooter was a decision they'd regret, and the fast draw of her revolver would be their last sight. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because tomorrow we have a special story for you. The saloon doors creaked as they swung open, and the sounds of rowdy laughter and clinking glasses came to a sudden halt. 4 men, each with dark hats tipped low over their eyes, shuffled in, their boots scraping against the wooden floor. The sunlight from outside caught the glint of silver badges pinned to their worn coats, but the patrons barely seemed to notice. The town of Sagebrush had long ago grown used to its share of troublemakers. Jack the Devil Creed stood at the head of the group, his mouth stretched in a cruel grin. His reputation was well known across Arizona and even farther west. There was no one faster on the draw, or so he claimed. His 3 companions, each with their own sordid history, followed closely behind him, eyeing the few patrons who remained seated at the bar. But their attention was soon pulled to the woman behind it. Clara O'Donnell was wiping a glass with a cloth, her gaze never wavering as the outlaws approached. She had seen trouble before, had faced men with far worse reputations than these. But something about their swagger made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The room was tense. It always was when outlaws entered the saloon, but there was a strange energy in the air tonight. The way they moved, how they seemed to fill the space with their sheer audacity. It unsettled Clara. She stood tall, setting the glass down and looking at them through steady, cold eyes. Jack Creed leaned against the counter, tipping his hat back with one hand as he scanned the room. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice dripping with malice. "Looks like we've found ourselves the infamous widow who thinks she can run a business in these parts." His grin widened as he eyed her revolver, the handle of which was tucked neatly beneath the counter. Clara's hand rested just above it, but her face remained an impassive mask. "That's right," she said, her voice calm, almost unnervingly so. "I run this saloon, and I don't take kindly to drifters with bad intentions. You might want to reconsider what you're about to do." The outlaws snickered amongst themselves, exchanging knowing glances. Creed chuckled, his voice low and mocking. "Reconsider? Now, sweetheart, we're here for a little entertainment. We've heard tell you're a bit of a sharpshooter, but let me ask you, you really think you can take on 4 men? He let the words hang in the air, his eyes glinting with malicious amusement. "You might be a widow, but you ain't got a chance against the devil." For a moment, Clara said nothing, her gaze unwavering as she studied him. She felt the heat of the room, the oppressive silence as every man present awaited her next move. But the truth was, she didn't need to move fast. She had a reputation for a reason, and for all the bravado in the world, Creed's men were about to learn just how quickly things could turn deadly in Sagebrush. Clara's fingers brushed the cool, worn leather of her holster, her thumb resting lightly against the grip of her revolver. She had never drawn first. She had learned long ago that letting the enemy make the first move was the best strategy. But tonight was different. The outlaws didn't know it yet, but they had made a grave mistake. The room was silent for a moment, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then, Creed leaned in a little closer, his grin widening to show a row of yellowed teeth. "You look like a woman who's spent too much time hiding behind a bar, sweetheart. Maybe it's time someone taught you a lesson. You might be quick with that gun, but no woman can outdraw me." Clara's heart was calm, her pulse steady. She had done this countless times before. She could feel the weight of her revolver, the familiar comfort of its presence in her hand, even though it remained just barely out of sight. The others in the room watched, as though mesmerized by the tension building in the air. But it wasn't fear that ran through Clara's veins. No, it was something sharper, something colder. In the back of her mind, she wondered what Creed might be thinking right now. Did he truly believe she would back down? Did he have any inkling of the legend he was about to face? It didn't matter. Clara's fingers wrapped fully around the grip of her revolver, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. She wasn't afraid. The town of Sagebrush was hers, and no man, not even the devil himself, would take it from her. For a moment, everything in the saloon seemed to freeze. The low murmur of conversation that had existed before the outlaws walked in was now gone, replaced by the sound of Creed's men shifting uncomfortably. The flickering light of the oil lamps cast long shadows against the walls, adding a haunting stillness to the room. Every person in that saloon felt the tension, but none dared to move, none but Clara. Her fingers tightened around the revolver, her grip firm and unshakable. Creed's mocking smile faltered for just a second, his eyes narrowing in a mix of amusement and curiosity. He had seen plenty of gunfighters in his time, men who stood tall and boasted of their abilities, but this was different. There was something about the way she held herself, the calm, deliberate air of someone who had lived through too many battles to be afraid of one more. "You really think you can take all of us on?" one of Creed's men sneered. His voice was high-pitched, the bravado of a man trying to mask his own nervousness. Clara didn't respond to him. Her eyes never left Creed. She could feel the beat of her own heart in her chest, steady and unhurried. This was her world. This was her domain. These men had no place here, and they would soon learn why. Jack Creed's lips curled into a slight smile. "I'll give you one chance, sweetheart. Put that gun down, and maybe we'll let you walk out of here alive. But if you keep looking at me like that, well, then we're gonna have ourselves a little problem." The room was heavy with the scent of dust and whiskey, the clinking of glasses, and the low murmur of anxious whispers from the few remaining patrons who dared to watch. It was clear they had all heard the rumors about Clara O'Donnell, the widow with the deadly aim, but seeing her face to face was a different matter altogether. Clara's lips parted slightly, just enough to speak, and her voice was as cool as the air before a storm. "You're already dead men walking," she said, her words low and dangerous, but with the undeniable edge of truth. Creed's eyes flashed with anger, his hand instinctively hovering over his own holster. He'd never been spoken to like that before, least of all by a woman. But something about Clara's confidence, her utter lack of fear, made his grip twitch. Then it happened in an instant. Without warning, Clara's hand shot up, her revolver clearing leather and firing with a speed that no one could have expected. The deafening crack of the gunshot echoed through the saloon. It rang out like thunder, the noise so sharp that it seemed to rattle the very walls. In the blink of an eye, Creed's first man, the one who had mocked her just moments before, dropped to the floor, his face contorted in shock, a hole between his eyes where Clara's bullet had found its mark. The room fell silent. Creed's hand had barely cleared the holster when he saw his man go down, his lifeless body slumping into the dirt. A gasp went through the room, one of disbelief. The man had been standing directly in front of Clara, and yet, she had shot him without even blinking. Creed's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse quickening as his eyes flicked to the other two outlaws standing behind him. "Get her!" Creed barked, his voice sharp with panic. The second man drew his revolver, but before he could even bring it up to aim, Clara's hand was already moving again. This time, the shot rang out so quickly that the man had no time to react. He crumpled to the floor, blood seeping from the wound in his chest as his gun clattered uselessly to the ground. Now, only Creed and one other man remained standing, but the fear was already evident in their eyes. The saloon's patrons were frozen, some still staring at Clara in awe, others too terrified to even breathe. Clara didn't flinch. She stood tall behind the bar, her stance unwavering as she reloaded her revolver with a calmness that was almost unsettling. She wasn't even breaking a sweat. Her eyes never left Creed's, her gaze as cold as steel. He was quick on the draw, no doubt about that. But Clara was faster, and her aim was deadlier. "You don't want to do this," Creed said, his voice now trembling with a hint of desperation. He took a step back, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver, but it was clear that the confidence he once had was slipping fast. "I already did," Clara replied, her tone matter-of-fact, as if this were just another day at the office. The remaining outlaw, the one still standing by Creed's side, was now looking at his leader with wide eyes. His hand hovered over his own weapon, but his body was tense, uncertain. It was clear he wasn't ready to meet the same fate as his friends. Creed's voice lowered, a more pleading tone now evident. "Listen, sweetheart, you don't have to." Before he could finish, Clara fired again, her revolver barking with that familiar crack. Creed's hand dropped, the revolver falling to the floor as a bullet tore through his shoulder. He staggered back, eyes wide with pain and shock. The final outlaw's hand shook as he drew his gun, but Clara's barrel was already aimed directly at him. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no moment of mercy. She was a woman of action, not words, and she knew what had to be done. The outlaw never even had the chance to pull the trigger. Another shot rang out, and he dropped to the ground with a strangled gasp. The room was now silent, save for the heavy breathing of the few remaining patrons and the soft thud of Creed hitting the floor. His eyes were wide, filled with shock and fear. He reached out weakly, trying to pull himself to his feet, but his body wouldn't obey. Clara stood over him, her revolver still smoking in her hand, her gaze cold and unforgiving. "You should have listened," she said, her voice a low whisper. "No one crosses me." As Creed writhed in agony on the floor, Clara took a single step back, her gaze sweeping over the room. The saloon was still, as if the entire town was holding its breath. The legends of Clara O'Donnell were no longer just whispers. They were reality, and Sagebrush would never be the same again. The saloon was deathly still, as if time itself had stopped. The once occupied tables sat empty, and even the crickets outside seemed to have silenced themselves, as if the town of Sagebrush was holding its breath in the wake of the bloodshed. Clara's revolver remained steady in her hand, its cold barrel glistening in the lamplight. Her eyes scanned the fallen men around her. 3 were already dead, and Creed, though still alive, was losing blood fast. The other patrons, who had once stared at her in awe, now seemed to shrink into the corners of the room, afraid to even blink. Her stance was unshaken. Clara O'Donnell had lived through this before. The shock, the blood, the screams. For her, this was simply another day in a long line of encounters that had forged her into a legend. But she could feel the weight of the silence in the room, the weight of the tension in the air. She had made her point, but the aftermath would remain. Creed gasped, his breathing labored as he tried to drag himself closer to the bar, his fingers trembling with desperation. You'll pay for this," he spat, his voice hoarse with pain. "You've got no idea who I am. You think you've won, but you've just—" Clara's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a faint, humorless smile. "I don't care who you are," she said calmly, her voice colder than the desert night. "You came here looking for trouble, and now you've found it." She stepped forward, her boots silent on the wooden floor as she approached him. Her revolver was still drawn, its muzzle pointed directly at Creed's chest. There was no pity in her eyes, just a cold, resolute certainty that this was the way it had to be. Creed's eyes flickered with fear, but there was also something else there. Hatred. He had underestimated her, thought that his reputation and his bravado would be enough to intimidate a woman like Clara, but she had proven him wrong in the most brutal way possible. Now, he was facing the consequences of his arrogance. The room was thick with the stench of gunpowder and blood. Clara could feel the stares of the remaining patrons on her, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. They had all heard the stories, but they had never seen a gunfight like this. They had never seen a woman like Clara O'Donnell, and now they would never forget her. Creed's hand trembled as he reached for his gun, but Clara was faster. In a single, fluid motion, she aimed her revolver and fired, the shot echoing through the saloon. Creed's hand froze mid-reach, his face contorted in pain as the bullet tore through his wrist, rendering him incapable of drawing his weapon. He fell to the floor with a grunt, his body writhing in agony. His eyes were wide, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. But it was too late. The blood loss had already taken its toll. He was fading fast. Clara stood over him, her revolver still trained on his chest. She watched him, her expression unreadable. She had seen men die in many different ways, some with dignity, others with desperation. But Creed's final moments were filled with nothing but regret. "I should have stayed in my grave," Creed whispered, his voice barely audible. You're a devil yourself, woman." Clara didn't respond. She had heard that line before, had heard it from men who thought themselves invincible, only to be proven wrong. The truth was simple. In this world, the quickest draw was often the one who lived. And that wasn't Creed. With a final, heavy breath, Creed's body went limp, and his head hit the floor with a dull thud. The room remained silent for a long while. Clara holstered her revolver, the cold metal sliding back into place with a smooth, practiced motion. She glanced around the saloon, her eyes sweeping over the few remaining patrons who had dared to watch the massacre unfold. None of them spoke. None of them moved. The room was still as death. Clara's voice broke the silence, sharp and unyielding. "Anyone else want to test their luck?" For a long moment, no one dared to answer. The patrons looked at one another, fear in their eyes. It wasn't just the memory of the gunfight that held them captive. It was Clara herself. The legend of the sharpshooter had been made flesh in the span of just a few seconds. She had ended the lives of 4 men in the blink of an eye, without a hint of hesitation. One man finally spoke, his voice trembling. "You've made your point, ma'am. No one here's gonna cross you." Clara's eyes lingered on him for a moment before she gave a single, sharp nod. "Good. Let's keep it that way." Without another word, she turned and walked to the back of the saloon, leaving the dead bodies of the outlaws behind her. The patrons, still frozen in their seats, watched her leave, their eyes wide with a mix of respect and fear. The doors to the saloon creaked as Clara passed through them, stepping out into the warm desert night. The moon hung high above the town, casting a silvery glow over the dirt streets of Sagebrush. The air was still and quiet, the only sound the distant chirping of crickets and the faint rustle of the wind in the dry desert brush. Clara didn't look back. She had made her mark on this town, and now it was time to move on. She didn't need to stick around and collect her bounty or boast of her victory. The legend of Clara O'Donnell had already been cemented in the minds of those who had witnessed her quick draw, and nothing would ever erase it. Sagebrush would never forget the widow who had outdrawn the devil. The desert night felt endless as Clara made her way down the main street of Sagebrush. The flickering lanterns cast long shadows across the dirt road, the faint echoes of crickets filling the air. The town was eerily quiet now, like a place that had just witnessed the kind of violence that was too dark to forget but too dangerous to speak of. Clara's boots crunched against the parched earth with each step, the sound of her movement breaking the heavy stillness. Her hand rested lightly on the handle of her revolver, though she didn't expect any more trouble tonight. The town was afraid of her now. They had seen firsthand what she was capable of, and that kind of fear could be the most effective kind of protection. She reached the edge of town where her horse was tethered to a post, its coat dark under the moonlight. Clara paused for a moment, her gaze lifting to the horizon. The dry, endless expanse of the Arizona desert stretched out before her, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of the night's events settle over her. The life of an outlaw, or perhaps just a woman who had been forced to survive in a man's world, was never an easy one. Clara had learned long ago that the only way to make it through was to take control, to never show weakness, to always be quicker than the man who came after you. She wasn't just the quickest draw west of the Mississippi. She was a legend because she had lived through it all, outwitting, outrunning, and outgunning anyone who dared to challenge her. But something in the back of her mind nagged at her, a question she couldn't shake. Was it enough? Could she ever really find peace? Or was she doomed to keep moving, running from the past and the endless string of trouble that seemed to follow her wherever she went? She mounted her horse, the saddle creaking under her weight, and gave the reins a light tug. The horse snorted and trotted forward, moving at a steady pace down the empty road. Clara had no particular destination in mind, but she knew that staying in Sagebrush for too long wouldn't be wise. The reputation she had just solidified would surely attract more attention, and she didn't need anyone coming after her. As the horse carried her further away from the town, the lights of Sagebrush faded into the distance. The only sounds now were the rhythmic beat of the horse's hooves against the dirt and the distant howl of a coyote in the night. It was a lonely sound, but it didn't bother her. Clara had always been alone, and after everything she'd been through, solitude had become a companion. But even in the quiet of the desert, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her. It wasn't a sound, nor was it a shadow in the distance. It was more of a sense, a lingering presence, like the watchful eyes of someone who knew her too well. Clara didn't turn back. She kept her focus straight ahead, her grip tight on the reins, her mind sharp and clear. If someone was following her, they'd be foolish to try and take her on now. They had already seen what she was capable of, and she wasn't about to give anyone the chance to make another attempt. The road stretched on for miles, a ribbon of dirt through the dark desert. But as the minutes ticked by, Clara began to feel that prickling sensation again, the feeling of eyes on her back. This time, she wasn't imagining it. Her instincts, honed over years of facing down men with bad intentions, were screaming at her. She was being followed. She slowed her horse, letting it walk at a more deliberate pace. Her fingers drifted down to the revolver at her hip, her thumb resting lightly against the cold metal. She didn't know who was back there, but she knew it wasn't someone just passing through. The sound of hooves on the desert floor grew louder, closer. Clara's hand moved to her gun, ready to draw at the slightest provocation. She was not in the mood for another confrontation, but she wasn't about to let herself be ambushed. The rider was close now, the sound of their horse's hooves unmistakable. Clara tensed, her senses heightened as she shifted her weight in the saddle, preparing herself for what was to come. A figure appeared in the distance, just barely visible against the horizon. It was a rider on horseback, moving swiftly, the outline of the rider's silhouette clear against the starlit sky. Clara didn't make any sudden moves. She waited, her breath steady, her body poised. As the rider grew closer, she could make out the details of his figure. A tall man, his face obscured by the brim of a wide hat, a dark cloak billowing behind him as he rode. He didn't speak at first, simply rode alongside her at a distance, his eyes hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. The air between them was thick with tension, and Clara could feel the pull of the encounter, the anticipation of what was to come. Finally, the man spoke, his voice deep and smooth, but with an edge of something dangerous. "I've heard stories about you, Miss O'Donnell, but I never thought I'd actually meet you." Clara didn't reply right away, choosing instead to study the stranger. There was something about his tone that made her instincts flare. He wasn't afraid of her, and that made him dangerous. "I don't take kindly to being followed," Clara said evenly, her voice as sharp as a knife. "You'd be wise to turn around and go back to whatever hole you crawled out of." The man chuckled, low and dark, the sound carried on the desert wind. "I'm afraid that's not an option, Miss O'Donnell. Not unless you want it to be." Clara's hand hovered just above her revolver, her fingers twitching slightly as she prepared for whatever move he might make. She didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but she wasn't about to take any chances. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The man pulled his horse closer, the distance between them closing with each passing second. He didn't answer her question, instead reaching into his coat and pulling out a wanted poster, Clara's wanted poster. He held it up, letting the wind catch the edges of the paper. Clara's face stared back at her, her likeness almost uncanny in its detail. The bounty listed beneath her name was substantial, a price that could buy a lot of trouble. "You've made quite a name for yourself," he said, his smile evident even though his face was obscured by the darkness. "And I've come to collect." The night air seemed to grow colder as Clara's eyes fixed on the wanted poster that the stranger held up between them. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze, but the image of her face was unmistakable, sharp, determined, and unyielding. Underneath her likeness, the bounty was clearly listed, a figure large enough to draw any man or outlaw into the fray. But the stranger's words carried a weight all their own, one that sent a ripple of tension through the air. "You've come for me," Clara said, her voice flat, betraying none of the emotions that twisted within her. She could feel the weight of her own heart thundering in her chest, but she didn't show it. She never did. The man's smile was a thin line of amusement, but there was something in his eyes, something calculating. He wasn't just after the money. He had come here for something more. "I've heard about the legend of Clara O'Donnell," he said, his voice smooth but dripping with sarcasm. "The sharpshooter who put down a whole gang of outlaws in a single afternoon. A woman with a fast hand, faster than most men in this land. I must say, I was hoping to see for myself." Clara remained silent. She didn't need to reply. She had lived through too many men underestimating her to waste words. They all thought they could take her down, that the reputation of a lone woman couldn't possibly be as dangerous as the real outlaws. But they never learned. The man leaned forward in his saddle, his dark eyes narrowing. "You've made quite a name for yourself, Miss O'Donnell. But tonight, I think you're going to finally meet your match." Clara's hand was already on the grip of her revolver. She didn't move it yet, but the familiarity of it against her skin was like an old friend. In the next breath, she could send this man to the dust, just like the others before him. She had a reputation to uphold, and if this stranger was foolish enough to challenge her, she would show him exactly what a quick draw meant. The horse beneath her shifted, restive, sensing the tension in the air, but Clara kept it still. "You've made a mistake," she said softly, almost conversationally. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The man grinned, his hand slowly slipping towards his own holster. "I'm well aware of who you are, Miss O'Donnell. The stories, the whispers, the woman who doesn't flinch when the lead starts flying." His fingers brushed the handle of his gun, and the sound seemed to sharpen the stillness around them. But legends are often just that, stories. And stories don't stop bullets. Clara's fingers tightened on the grip of her revolver, her heart beating steadily in her chest. She had been waiting for this moment, and she wasn't about to back down now. The standoff was as inevitable as the rising sun. She could feel the pull of the desert wind, a subtle reminder that there was nothing here but the two of them and the silent promise of violence hanging in the air. But Clara didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, she drew her revolver. The sound of the shot shattered the night. A split second before the man had even fully drawn his weapon, Clara's bullet found its mark, striking his hand. His revolver fell to the dirt, the sharp clang of metal against stone echoing in the stillness. The man gasped, his face contorting in pain, as his other hand shot out to clutch the bleeding wound. Clara's horse stood stock still, its hooves planted firmly in the dust, its rider as calm as a desert evening. Her revolver still held steady, aimed directly at the stranger, who now swayed in his saddle, clearly struggling to remain upright. "You were right about one thing," Clara said quietly, her voice a calm counterpoint to the chaos of the moment. "Legends are just stories." She allowed her gaze to sweep over him, her expression still unreadable. "But stories come with endings. And this is yours." The man, pale and panting, met her eyes through the haze of pain. His breath was shallow, each exhale a struggle as he tried to regain some semblance of composure. He was still gripping his wounded hand with a grimace, his other arm weakly clutching the reins. "I should have known," he muttered through clenched teeth, his voice laced with both frustration and grudging admiration. "I've heard enough stories to know you're no ordinary woman, but I had to try. I figured if I could catch you off guard." Clara cut him off with a single, curt motion of her gun. "You should have stuck to your own kind, stranger. You're out of your league." She looked at him with cold finality. "If you still want to fight, it'll be your last. You can run back to wherever you came from, or you can bleed out right here. It's your call." For a long moment, the man didn't speak. His eyes were filled with pain, but beneath that, there was something else, something like regret. Maybe he was finally realizing how far his arrogance had taken him. Clara gave him a long, searching look, her revolver still raised, ready. He could make the choice, or he could die for his mistake. Either way, she had already made her peace with it. "I thought I could take you," the man said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, laced with defeat. Thought I could prove that no legend is real, but I was wrong. You're the real thing. Clara didn't flinch. I'm not a thing, she replied, her tone steady and unyielding. I'm a woman who learned how to survive. Nothing more, nothing less. The man's shoulders sagged. Slowly, carefully, he turned his horse around. The pain was evident in every move, but his pride was still intact, barely. I'll live, he muttered, his voice tinged with bitterness. But you haven't seen the last of me. Clara's lips curled slightly at the edge, a rare flicker of emotion. If you're smart, she called after him, you'll keep it that way. And just like that, the man was gone, fading into the desert night. Clara watched him go, her eyes never leaving his retreating figure. She had heard his words, but she knew better than to trust them. This was a world built on survival, and she wasn't about to let anyone, not even a wounded fool like him, come back for another try. She turned her horse around and rode off into the desert, knowing full well that as long as she carried the title of sharpshooter, men like him would keep coming for her. But she was ready. She always was. The desert stretched endlessly before Clara, the dark silhouette of the mountains on the horizon like silent sentinels, watching over the land that had always been her home. The world around her was vast and unforgiving, but it was hers. She had learned to read its signs. The way the wind whispered through the sagebrush, the way the sun burned across the horizon at dusk, the way the silence could shift to violence in the blink of an eye. But tonight, there was no immediate danger. Yet, something lingered in the back of her mind. The man she had just sent away was a reminder that trouble never truly left. There was always someone out there, looking to make a name for themselves, someone who believed they could take her down. But Clara had survived this long because she understood one simple truth. The desert had no mercy, and neither did she. Her horse moved at a steady pace, its hooves beating a rhythm on the worn trail beneath them. The saddle creaked softly as she shifted in her seat, adjusting the weight of the gun belt around her waist. It had been a while since she had let her guard down, and tonight, she felt that familiar pull of restlessness. Sagebrush had been a brief stop, a place to take care of business and leave behind the past. But the past never stayed in one place for long. As the night deepened, Clara began to make her way toward the foothills of the mountains, where a small creek ran through the canyon. It was a quiet, peaceful spot, a place where she could clear her mind, wash off the blood that still clung to her skin, and be alone. She had earned the right to be alone. But as she approached the bend in the path, a flicker of movement caught her eye, a shadow in the distance, hidden against the jagged rocks. At first, she thought it was the wind or an animal, but the shape was too deliberate, too still. Her hand instinctively moved to her revolver, fingers resting on the grip as she slowed the horse. The world around her went still again, like the calm before a storm. She had learned long ago that when you sensed something out of place, it was best to be ready. And ready she was. The figure stepped out from behind the rocks, and Clara's eyes narrowed as she recognized the silhouette. It was the man she had just sent running from Sagebrush, the one who had thought he could collect her bounty. But something was different now. There was no sign of injury on him, no sign of weakness. He was back, and this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, two other riders emerged from the darkness. Tall, broad-shouldered figures, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. Clara could see the glint of their weapons. Rifles slung across their backs, holsters ready at their hips. These weren't just any outlaws. This was a carefully orchestrated ambush. The man who had first confronted Clara stepped forward, his face no longer pale from the bullet wound she had given him. He wore a cocky grin, his demeanor a far cry from the wounded fool she had left behind. "I figured you'd be expecting this," he said, his voice smooth and confident now. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for, Miss O'Donnell. But what you don't know is that this time, you're outnumbered." Clara's fingers tightened on her revolver, her pulse steady but quickening. She had dealt with ambushes before, but this felt different. This wasn't just some random encounter. It was personal. These men had made it personal. The leader of the group, a man with a thick mustache and piercing blue eyes, spoke up. "You think you can walk away from this, Clara? You think you can shoot your way out of every mess you make?" Well, tonight, we've got a little surprise for you. Clara didn't flinch. She had faced down worse odds, and she wasn't about to start second-guessing herself now. You've made a mistake, she said, her voice low and calm, her eyes never leaving the men. You're out here, in the middle of nowhere, thinking you've got the advantage. But you don't. Not yet. The man with the mustache laughed, a rough, harsh sound that seemed to echo off the canyon walls. You're a legend, sure, but legends die like everyone else. It's just a matter of time. Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. The only response that mattered now was action. In a flash, she was off her horse, her feet hitting the ground with a soft thud as she slid her revolver from its holster. The men hesitated, no doubt thinking they had the upper hand. They didn't realize that this wasn't an ordinary woman standing before them. She was a survivor, a sharpshooter whose every move was calculated, precise. The first man lunged at her, his rifle aimed at her chest. But Clara was already moving. She ducked low, her revolver coming up in one smooth motion, firing before the man could get a shot off. The bullet struck his hand, and his rifle dropped to the ground with a clang. He screamed in pain, clutching his now bloodied wrist. Clara didn't wait to see how he reacted. She had already turned her attention to the second rider, who was drawing his own weapon. The second shot rang out, faster than any of them could anticipate, and the man crumpled to the ground with a hole in his shoulder. He didn't make a sound as he fell, too stunned to even register the pain. The third man, the one with the mustache, cursed and drew his own revolver, aiming directly at Clara's chest. But Clara was faster. She stepped to the side, the bullet grazing her jacket but missing its mark. She fired once more, her shot clean and sure, and the man's hat flew off as the bullet grazed his ear. The mustached man staggered back, momentarily disoriented, but Clara didn't give him a chance to recover. She was already on him, the barrel of her revolver aimed at his face. You should have stayed in your hole, she said quietly. The man's hands were trembling as he raised them in surrender. His gun now dropped at his feet. The other two men, still writhing in pain on the ground, looked up at Clara with fear in their eyes. Clara's gaze swept over them all, cold and unyielding. You've got a choice. You can crawl back to wherever you came from, or you can keep pushing your luck. But either way, your lives end tonight. The silence that followed was thick and tense, the only sound the wind brushing against the rocks. Finally, the mustached man spoke, his voice hoarse and fearful. We're done. We're done, Miss O'Donnell. We'll leave you be. Just don't kill us. Clara lowered her revolver slightly, but didn't holster it. Good choice. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made it clear she wouldn't hesitate to finish what she had started if they gave her any reason. With one last glance at the three men, Clara turned and mounted her horse. Without another word, she spurred it forward, leaving them behind in the dust. She had made her point, but the desert had a way of reminding her that the next challenge was always just around the corner. The night passed quietly as Clara rode deeper into the desert. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a soft, pale light over the barren landscape. The wind howled in the distance, but the only sound Clara could hear was the rhythmic thudding of her horse's hooves on the dry earth. She wasn't entirely sure where she was going, but she knew she needed to get away from Sagebrush. The encounter with the trio of outlaws had rattled her, though she didn't show it. It was rare that anyone managed to sneak up on her, but tonight, it had happened. The desert had always been her ally, her refuge, but sometimes even it could hide dangers. The man with the mustache, the one who had organized the ambush, had underestimated her, just like everyone else who ever thought they could take her down. Clara's thoughts were interrupted as the low howl of a coyote reached her ears. It was distant, but it seemed to echo in the vast, empty space around her. The sound sent a shiver down her spine, not from fear, but from something deeper, more primal. She had spent years in these lands, but sometimes the desert felt like it could swallow you whole. She didn't allow herself to dwell on the feeling. Instead, her focus remained on the horizon, where the rugged peaks of the mountains loomed in the distance. The road ahead was long and unforgiving, but Clara had long ago learned to walk the path with no expectation of mercy. The silence between her and her horse was comforting, as though the world was offering her a brief reprieve from the violence that often followed her. But Clara knew better than to believe in moments of peace. Trouble never stopped coming. It always found its way to her doorstep. The horse snorted, and Clara's eyes narrowed as a flicker of movement caught her attention in the distance. For a brief moment, she thought it was nothing. Just another trick of the desert night, perhaps a shadow or an illusion cast by the moonlight. But as the figure grew closer, Clara's instincts flared. It was a rider, coming from the same direction she had just come from. The figure was a silhouette against the vast, open space, a lone figure galloping towards her. She didn't wait to see who it was, her hand already brushing the handle of her revolver as she urged her horse forward, keeping her eyes fixed on the figure. The desert was a place of constant danger, and she wasn't about to let herself become a target. As the rider closed the gap, Clara could see that it was one of the men from the ambush, the one she had shot in the shoulder. He was alone, his face grim and determined as he rode toward her. His horse kicked up dust as it moved, its rider hunched low over the saddle, clearly pushing it harder than was wise. Clara's hand tightened on her revolver, but she didn't draw just yet. She knew that a wounded man like this wouldn't be able to mount another attack so soon. He had to be desperate, and that desperation made him more dangerous than he appeared. As he drew closer, the man raised a hand, signaling that he wasn't here to fight. His voice, rough and strained, called out to her over the wind. "Wait, Miss O'Donnell," he shouted, his tone filled with pain and urgency. "I'm not here to fight anymore. I just need your help." Clara's horse slowed, the rhythm of its hooves settling into a cautious trot. Her fingers remained on the revolver, but her eyes were locked on the man, studying him. The injury from her bullet was still visible, blood staining his shirt, but he seemed to be pushing through it with determination. "I don't help outlaws," Clara said coldly, her voice steady and sure. The man grimaced as he slowed his horse, but there was no sign of the cocky arrogance he had carried earlier. He was still holding his shoulder with one hand, his other grasping the reins. The desperation in his eyes was unmistakable. "I'm not asking for a handout," he said, his voice raw. "I'm just asking for a little mercy. You did your part, and I know I'm no match for you. But they—" he paused, glancing over his shoulder nervously. "They're still out there. The rest of my gang. They'll come after you, Miss O'Donnell. They won't stop. I just wanted to warn you." Clara didn't move. She kept her revolver trained on him, her expression unreadable. "Why should I trust you? After what you tried to do?" The man swallowed hard, his throat constricting with the effort. "I didn't know they were going to come at you like that. They were just using me. I thought I could get the jump on you, maybe prove myself, but I was wrong. Please, you've got to listen. They're coming for you. All of them. They'll keep coming until you're dead." Clara's grip on her gun loosened slightly as the man spoke. She could hear the sincerity in his voice, the raw truth of his words. His fear wasn't just for himself. He was afraid of what his gang would do to her. And in that fear, Clara recognized something familiar. She had been there herself, once, running from a world that didn't want to let her go. The man saw her hesitation and pressed on. "I'm not asking for you to save me, but I know you're the fastest draw in the West, and you can take them down. You're the only one who can." Clara didn't answer right away. She simply watched him, her gaze hard and unwavering. She had always fought alone. She had always trusted herself above anyone else. But this was different. "You should have stayed out of it," Clara said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "But if you really want to make up for it, here's your chance. Lead me to them. I'll take care of it." The man's face paled, but a flicker of relief passed through his eyes. He nodded slowly, swallowing hard. "I'll show you. I swear." Clara spurred her horse forward, motioning for him to follow. As they moved deeper into the desert, the wind at their backs and the silence between them pressing down like a weight, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this new threat would be bigger than anything she had ever faced. But for now, she was ready. The desert stretched endlessly before Clara, the heat of the day still lingering in the dry air, but the night had a biting chill. The man, now riding behind her at a safe distance, kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, his hand clutching his wound as they moved swiftly across the arid land. Clara, however, remained calm, alert and focused, her every sense honed to the land around her. She didn't trust him, not entirely. But for now, his warnings seemed genuine. They had left the trail behind them, moving deeper into the desert. Clara knew the way. She had spent years in these lands, long enough to know that the wrong turn could mean hours lost in the unforgiving landscape. Yet, the feeling gnawing at her gut told her that this wasn't just another man trying to use her. The man was still trailing behind, riding with a limp, though he kept his pace. She could hear him struggling with every breath, his voice barely rising above the wind when he spoke. "I told you," he said, his voice ragged. "They're waiting for you. They're not far." Clara didn't respond, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of movement. The sound of hooves on sand was the only thing that filled the air. It was too quiet. The man spoke again, more urgently this time. "You don't understand. These men, they're not just regular outlaws. They've been hunting you for months. They're part of a bigger group. There's more of them than you think. They've got a score to settle." Clara's hand rested lightly on her revolver, her fingers grazing the worn handle. She knew the type. Outlaws who would stop at nothing to settle their scores, no matter the cost. She had crossed paths with their kind before, and it had never ended well for them. But this time, it felt different. The urgency in the man's voice, the way his eyes darted around the desert, they weren't lies. "I've heard that before," Clara said coldly, but she felt a flicker of unease settle in her chest. She had dealt with ruthless men in the past, but it was rare to hear of anyone hunting her down this actively. She was the predator in this game, not the prey. The man's voice quivered as he pushed his horse forward, trying to keep up with her pace. "I'm telling you the truth. You won't be able to take them all out by yourself. They're waiting to ambush you in a place called Devil's Hollow. It's a canyon about a mile ahead. The way the wind shifts there, you won't hear them coming until it's too late. You'll be surrounded. All of them." Clara's eyes flickered to the distance, where the jagged outline of the canyon began to appear on the horizon. Her instinct screamed at her to be cautious. Devil's Hollow. It had the ring of an outlaw trap, a place where men could hide and wait for the perfect moment to strike. But she wasn't afraid. Clara wasn't afraid of much anymore. She slowed her horse, giving the man a glance over her shoulder. He was still trying to keep up, his face pale with exertion. She could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear that had led him to warn her. "Lead the way," Clara said, her voice sharp. Without another word, he spurred his horse forward, and they headed toward the canyon. The silence between them was heavier now, thick with the understanding that this would likely be a fight to the death. Clara didn't know how many men were waiting for her, but the man's words had struck a chord with her. She would be outnumbered, and though she had faced worse odds, this situation felt different. There was something personal about this. The closer they got to Devil's Hollow, the more Clara could feel the tension building in the air. The wind was picking up, a low, mournful howling filling the space as they reached the entrance to the canyon. It was a narrow pass, barely wide enough for two horses to ride side by side. Clara slowed her horse to a walk, her eyes scanning the jagged walls that rose steeply on either side of them. The shadow of the canyon stretched long in the moonlight, and for a moment, she could almost feel the weight of the earth pressing down on her. It was a place that was meant to swallow people whole. She had to be careful. "Where exactly are they?" Clara asked quietly, never taking her eyes off the narrow path ahead. "They'll be waiting at the top," the man replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "The highest point. It's the perfect place to look down on you. There's nowhere to hide." Clara's grip tightened on her revolver. She could already feel the familiar sensation of her mind sharpening, preparing for what was to come. They reached the opening of the canyon, the narrow path stretching before them. Clara's senses were on high alert, every nerve in her body ready to spring into action. She could feel the eyes of her enemies, even though she couldn't see them yet. The air was thick with anticipation. As they moved deeper into the canyon, the sound of the wind intensified, whipping through the narrow passage and causing the walls to echo with its mournful cries. Clara's heart was steady, her movements slow and deliberate. The man, still behind her, seemed to be growing more anxious. His breathing was labored, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. "Something's not right," he muttered. "They're too quiet." Clara paused, her hand resting on her gun, her gaze scanning the dark crevices around them. She knew the feeling. It was the kind of quiet before the storm, when the world seemed to hold its breath just before everything went to hell. "Stay close," she ordered, turning her horse and taking a more cautious pace. They were nearly to the top of the canyon now, and Clara's instinct screamed at her. It was too quiet. They had walked straight into a trap. Suddenly, the stillness was shattered by the sound of gunfire. The first shot rang out, echoing off the canyon walls and shattering the silence that had held them in its grip. Clara's instincts kicked in immediately, her body moving before her mind could even register the sound. She twisted in the saddle, pulling her horse sharply to the side, just as another shot split the air, narrowly missing her. The man behind her yelled, his voice hoarse with panic. "They're coming from both sides." Clara didn't need to be told twice. The moment the shots were fired, she knew they were surrounded. The canyon walls were steep, and every crevice seemed to hold a hidden enemy. She could see movement above them now, dark figures silhouetted against the moonlight on the cliff edges. They had been waiting for her, lying in wait in the shadows, ready to strike when she was most vulnerable. Her hand moved to her revolver with practiced ease, her fingers finding the familiar grip. The gun was cold, but the weight of it brought a sense of clarity, a reminder that in moments like this, there was only one rule: survive. The first man fired again from a ledge above them. Clara's eyes locked onto his position, and she reacted without hesitation. She drew and fired, the revolver kicking in her hand, sending a bullet streaking toward the gunman. He crumpled as the bullet hit his chest, his body tumbling down the rock face with a sickening thud. But the others were closing in. Clara's horse was shifting beneath her, sensing the danger, but Clara kept it steady, guiding it with the ease of someone who had spent years riding the treacherous terrain of the desert. She was looking for any advantage, any escape route, but there was none. The canyon was a trap, and they were already too deep inside it. The man who had warned her was cowering behind his horse, clutching his wound and muttering to himself. His panic was palpable, and Clara shot him a glance over her shoulder. He was no help in this situation. "Get down," she shouted, her voice sharp and commanding. "Find cover." He hesitated, then scrambled behind a rock, trying to shield himself as best as he could. Clara didn't wait. She'd learned long ago that in situations like this, hesitation could mean death. The next shot came from the left. Another man, crouched behind a boulder, his rifle aimed directly at Clara. She ducked instinctively, feeling the wind from the bullet pass just inches from her ear. The danger was real now. They were closing in on her from all sides, and the only way out was through. Clara swiveled in her saddle, her revolver coming up again. She was already calculating her next move before her first shot landed. She fired once more, hitting the man on the left in the shoulder. He staggered back, his rifle falling from his hands as he screamed in pain. Another shot, this time from above. Clara felt the impact of the bullet hit the rock just beside her, showering her with debris. She didn't even flinch, her reflexes keeping her focused on the task at hand. She leaned low in her saddle, urging her horse forward into the narrow passageway where the shots were coming from. It was dangerous, too dangerous, but she had no choice. She couldn't let herself be pinned down. The sound of more horses approaching told her the worst. They were sending in reinforcements. The men were smart, splitting up to cover every angle, trying to force her into the open. But Clara wasn't about to play by their rules. With one swift motion, she kicked her horse into a gallop, charging through the narrow canyon, dodging shots as they rang out from every direction. The wind howled in her ears, but all she could hear was the rhythmic pounding of hooves and the sharp crack of gunfire. She rode like a ghost, moving faster than they could aim, a blur of motion that they couldn't track. She fired back as she galloped, her revolver kicking in her hand with each shot. Her aim was precise, each bullet finding its mark, taking down one of the attackers. But there were still too many. Another shot rang out, and Clara felt the sharp sting of pain in her side. She gritted her teeth, but she didn't slow down. The wound wasn't fatal, but it was enough to make her blood run colder. She could feel the warmth of it seeping through her shirt, but there was no time to stop. She needed to end this. Ahead of her, the canyon began to widen, a small plateau forming at the top of a rise. The men had set up shop there. This was where they were trying to drive her. They thought they could corner her, push her into a dead end, but Clara saw it differently. She spurred her horse forward, determined to reach the plateau before they did. She was outnumbered, but she wasn't outclassed. Her mind raced as she formulated her next move, every ounce of her focus on survival. As she neared the top of the rise, she saw them. 3 more men, waiting for her in the open. They were armed, rifles aimed directly at her. She was exposed, and she knew it. But she was faster. In one smooth motion, Clara drew her revolver again, taking out the first man before he could even squeeze the trigger. The second man was already reaching for his gun, but Clara fired first. He dropped before he could even get a shot off. The third man hesitated for a split second, eyes widening in fear as Clara's barrel swung toward him. She didn't hesitate. The shot rang out, and the man collapsed, his rifle clattering to the ground. Silence fell. Clara's breathing was labored, but she remained still, watching for any more movement. She had taken them out, but the danger wasn't over. There were still more men out there, and she couldn't afford to let her guard down. The man who had warned her earlier emerged from his cover, still clutching his side. His eyes were wide, a mix of awe and disbelief written on his face. You did it. You took them down," he said, his voice hoarse. Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. She had done what needed to be done, but the job wasn't finished. She could hear more voices in the distance, the sound of more men approaching. They weren't done yet. Clara turned her horse, heading back into the canyon, her revolver still drawn, her focus sharp. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Clara didn't have time to think. The battle had only just begun, and she knew that every second counted. The canyon was too narrow for a proper retreat, too open for full cover. The men were closing in from all sides, and if she didn't act fast, she would be overwhelmed. Her senses sharpened, every sound amplified. The wind scraping against the jagged rocks, the distant crunch of boots on sand, the unmistakable sound of horses galloping toward her. Her horse was still moving, but she guided it quickly, the reins steady in her hands as she kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, scanning for any sign of movement. The man who had led her into this trap, the one she had saved, was now trailing behind her, limping heavily as he struggled to keep pace. He was no help, clearly struggling with his injury, but Clara had no time to worry about him. She had to stay focused. He had warned her, yes, but he had also put them both in this mess. There were more shots fired from the cliffside above, a deafening roar as another bullet flew dangerously close, narrowly missing Clara's ear. Her heart pounded, the adrenaline surging through her veins. She fired back without hesitation, her revolver barking out a single shot. She caught a glimpse of a figure tumbling from the ledge, but she didn't stop to watch. There was no time for mercy in a situation like this. Her mind raced as she pushed forward, moving her horse toward a higher rock formation that jutted out over the canyon. It was the only place that offered any kind of advantage, a place where she could take cover and fight back with a better vantage point. But the sounds of galloping horses were growing closer. They had reinforcements, more than she had initially thought. The outlaws had been waiting for her, and now they were surrounding her on all sides. She had only one option left. Get to the rocks. Clara shouted to the man trailing her, her voice cutting through the chaos. Now. He didn't need to be told twice. His face was pale, and he moved as quickly as he could, urging his horse toward the rocky outcropping she had chosen. Clara followed suit, her eyes darting across the battlefield, looking for any movement, any signs of weakness in the men who were trying to take her down. A group of 3 more men rode in from the left, emerging from the shadows. They were armed with rifles, their eyes cold with malice. Clara could see the way they had been trained. They knew how to fight, how to use the terrain to their advantage. But she had something they didn't: experience. She raised her revolver, firing 3 quick shots in rapid succession. 2 of the men crumpled immediately, their horses rearing as their riders fell. The third man hesitated, his rifle raised as he aimed directly at her. Clara didn't flinch. Before he could pull the trigger, Clara was already drawing again. Her shot rang out, and the man dropped his rifle, clutching his chest as he fell from his horse. His body hit the ground with a dull thud. Clara didn't stop to see if he was alive. She was already moving, her horse pushing forward toward the rocks, where she and the man could hopefully take cover long enough to regroup. The canyon had become a battleground, the sounds of gunfire and the pounding of hooves echoing off the walls. But Clara's focus was razor-sharp, her movements as fluid as water. She had been in enough of these fights to know how to survive. They reached the rocks, and Clara quickly dismounted, pulling the man down behind cover. He winced in pain as he hit the ground, his wound clearly slowing him down, but he didn't argue. Clara was already scanning the terrain, looking for the next threat. They were almost trapped. The men on the cliffs above had an advantage, high ground, better sight lines. But Clara wasn't about to let herself be cornered. She had taken on worse odds before. Clara's heart was still pounding, the taste of sweat on her lips. She wasn't sure how many men were left, but she knew they weren't going to stop. They would keep coming, until she was dead, or until they were. Another shot rang out, but this time it wasn't aimed at her. The bullet hit the rock just above her head, sending shards of debris flying. Clara ducked instinctively, her hand moving toward her revolver once more. But just as quickly as the shot was fired, a familiar voice called from across the battlefield. "Clara!" The voice shouted, ragged and strained. "It's me." Clara's eyes narrowed, her fingers still wrapped tightly around the grip of her revolver. She didn't recognize the voice, but something in the way it rang out, urgent, panicked, made her pause. Another shot rang out from above, but this time, it wasn't aimed at her. The shot struck the man who had warned her earlier, his body jerking as the bullet found its mark. He let out a strangled cry and fell to the ground beside Clara, his hand clutching his chest as blood pooled beneath him. Clara's eyes burned with rage. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was personal. The sound of approaching hooves broke her focus, and Clara's eyes snapped to the horizon, where another rider appeared on horseback. It was a tall figure, cloaked in shadows, but this time Clara didn't hesitate. She pulled her revolver up and fired. The figure reared back, the bullet just missing. Clara's mind was already shifting tactics. She had to make a move now before the other men regrouped. She darted from her cover, moving quickly and silently, her horse following at a trot. She had to stay on the move, fast, unpredictable. She didn't want to be pinned down in one place. As she reached the top of a nearby rise, Clara paused, breathing heavily, the wind carrying the scent of dust and blood. Her heart was still racing. She had to finish this, and she had to do it quickly. Clara's breath came in steady, controlled bursts as she peered over the rise, her eyes scanning the battlefield below. The men she had already taken down were scattered across the canyon floor, their horses whinnying in confusion. The remaining outlaws, 2 or maybe 3, were circling, regrouping and clearly trying to box her in. They were relentless, and they were desperate. But so was she. Her mind raced as her fingers gripped the cold steel of her revolver. She could feel the sting of the bullet wound in her side, a dull, persistent ache that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. The blood had slowed, but the pain was there, a reminder that even legends had their limits. She glanced back at the man who had tried to warn her, the one who had once been her unwilling guide. He was motionless now, the blood seeping from his chest and pooling around him, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. She hadn't had time to save him. He'd been an ally for only as long as he could serve a purpose, and now, in death, he had become one more casualty in the twisted game of survival. Clara turned her focus back to the situation at hand. She wasn't going to let his death be in vain. The outlaws had made the fatal mistake of underestimating her, and they were going to learn just how dangerous that mistake could be. The sound of horses approaching from behind snapped her back to reality. Clara shifted, her eyes narrowing as the sound of galloping hooves grew louder. Another 2 riders emerged from the narrow pass to her left, their faces shadowed beneath the brim of their hats. These men had the advantage. They were coming at her from both directions, trapping her in the narrow stretch between the cliffs. She had a choice to make: stay and face them head-on, or find a way to break out of the trap. Clara's mind was already working, her eyes flicking to the surrounding terrain. She didn't have time to outthink them. She had to act. With a quick, decisive motion, she dropped low to the ground, her body hidden behind the rocks. She could hear the horse's hooves pounding closer, and just as the riders rounded the corner, she moved. Her revolver was drawn in a heartbeat. Clara's shot rang out, the sound echoing through the canyon like a thunderclap. One of the men fell, his body jerking in the saddle as Clara's bullet struck him in the chest. The horse reared back, throwing the man to the ground in a crumpled heap. But Clara wasn't done. The second rider was already drawing his gun, his movements jerky with panic. He had seen what Clara was capable of, but it was too late for him to react. Clara fired again, her aim true. The bullet found its mark, and the second man crumpled as well, his revolver falling uselessly to the ground as his body slumped off the horse. For a moment, there was silence. The wind howled across the desert, and Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know if there were more men coming, but the feeling of victory was fleeting. The fight was never over until she could walk away, until she was out of the canyon, free of the trap they had set for her. But just as she began to stand, a voice broke the silence. "Don't think you're getting out of here that easily, O'Donnell." Clara whipped around, her revolver aimed at the voice before she even had time to think. Her eyes locked onto a figure in the distance, tall, with a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. The man was standing by the cliffside, his posture unnervingly calm. He was different from the others. There was no fear in his eyes, only certainty. Clara's fingers tightened around her revolver. She was already planning her next move, but something in the way he stood made her pause. He wasn't alone. There were more behind him, scattered along the edge of the cliffs. They were waiting for her to make a move, to give them an opening. "You're the last one standing," the man called out. His voice was smooth, calculating, like he was savoring the moment. "You think you've won? You think you've got the upper hand?" Clara didn't respond. She kept her gun aimed at him, her body tensed, ready to move at a second's notice. The air was thick with tension, but Clara's mind was clear. She had faced countless odds like this before. She wouldn't make the mistake of underestimating her opponent again. "Who are you?" Clara finally asked, her voice low and steady. The man smiled, the edges of his lips curling upward into a cruel grin. "You've heard of me, I'm sure. My name's Donovan Slade, and I'm here to collect what's mine." Clara's heart skipped a beat, and the realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Slade. The name was infamous, the leader of a ruthless gang of outlaws who had terrorized towns from here to Texas. He had a reputation for being as quick with a gun as he was with his words, and he had never left anyone alive who had crossed him. Clara's grip tightened on her revolver, but she didn't let the shock show on her face. "I don't know what you want from me, Slade," she said coldly, "but it's not going to happen." Slade's grin only widened, his fingers tapping lightly against the side of his holster. "Oh, I think it will," he said, his voice as smooth as silk. "You're the last piece of the puzzle, O'Donnell. Once you're gone, my business here is finished. No more trouble, no more legends to worry about. Just me and my men taking what we've earned." Clara didn't respond. She knew exactly what he was after. He wanted to take her down, make an example out of her, and solidify his hold over the outlaw territories. He had no idea how wrong he was. "You won't get the chance," she said, her voice steady. With a sudden, swift motion, Clara's hand snapped to her revolver. The world seemed to slow as she raised the gun, her finger pulling the trigger. The shot rang out, and Slade's grin faltered, his eyes widening in shock as the bullet grazed his shoulder. But he didn't fall. Clara's heart raced, but she didn't stop. She was already moving again, her body fluid, her mind focused on the kill. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The bullet grazed Donovan Slade's shoulder, but it wasn't enough to put him down. He staggered back a step, his eyes wide with shock. But that brief moment of vulnerability was all Clara needed. She had seen it before. Men who underestimated her, who thought they could survive the storm she brought. But they were wrong. Clara didn't hesitate. She fired again, her revolver singing a deadly tune as her aim was true. This time, the shot hit its mark, a clean, solid hit that sent Slade stumbling back, his body jerking with the impact. His hand shot up instinctively, reaching for the wound on his chest, but it was too late. The shock of the bullet left him gasping for breath. Clara's heart was still pounding, but she wasn't done. The moment of victory was fleeting, and she knew it. She had just taken down a man who had terrorized the West, but there were still more out there. More men waiting to take her down. The canyon wasn't hers yet. It wouldn't be until she had made sure every last one of them was dealt with. She didn't look back to see if Slade was dead. She couldn't afford to. His men were still out there, and the rest of his gang wouldn't wait long before they retaliated. Clara's fingers tightened on her revolver, her senses keen as she scanned the cliffs above her. There was movement, shadows flitting across the jagged rocks. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. She had to finish this. Her horse shifted restlessly, sensing the tension in the air. Clara's eyes flicked to the animal for a moment. There would be no time for a retreat. No time for anything but the next shot, the next move, the next death. A crackle of gunfire tore through the silence, a bullet slamming into the rocks just beside her. Clara ducked instinctively, her body hitting the ground in a smooth roll as she brought herself up into a crouch, her revolver already in hand, her gaze locked onto the cliffs above. She was moving again, fluid, precise. She couldn't be cornered. There was no room for that. Not with her back pressed against the rocks and more gunfire coming from the high ground. But Clara knew how to use the terrain to her advantage. The outlaws up there thought they had her trapped. They didn't realize they were about to learn what it meant to be underestimated. Clara reached down, grabbed the reins of her horse, and urged it forward. Her movements were deliberate, her eyes never straying from the shadowed cliffs above. She could see the outline of a man now, crouched low, aiming at her. Before he could fire, Clara's revolver barked again. The shot was fast, clean, and the man dropped, his rifle clattering to the ground as his body hit the earth. Her heart was still thundering in her chest, but Clara didn't pause to savor the victory. She didn't have time for that. There were still more. She could hear them now, the scuffle of boots, the whisper of movement across the rocks. They were coming, gathering, trying to pin her in. She had no choice but to move forward, but the narrowing canyon gave her fewer and fewer options. Clara kept her focus, her instincts sharp as she moved forward, carefully picking her way through the boulders. The adrenaline surged in her veins, but she knew the moment she lost control, the moment her focus slipped, would be the moment they'd get the better of her. Suddenly, a flash of movement from above made Clara freeze. A second too late, one of the men dropped from the ledge, landing on the ground just a few feet from her. He was quick, but not quick enough. Clara drew her revolver with a speed that was almost impossible to follow and fired. The man's face twisted in surprise as he fell, the impact of Clara's bullet sending him sprawling onto the rocks. She didn't wait for him to hit the ground. Another shot rang out before he even had a chance to move again. That was how she operated, faster than anyone. A shot meant death, and she didn't hesitate. But more shots followed, this time from multiple directions. The men were closing in again, but Clara didn't stop to count how many there were. They would learn soon enough that their numbers meant nothing against a woman who had been running this race her whole life. A rock skittered down from the ledge above, a signal that they were coming. She couldn't take them all at once, not with her horse exposed and no clear escape route. She needed to move again. Clara took a step back, her eyes darting between the cliffs, calculating her next move. There was no way out unless she made one. She spotted an opening, an outcrop just a few feet to her left. It was narrow, and it would give her just enough space to fight back. Her horse pawed the ground, nervous, but Clara patted it briefly before urging it toward the outcrop. She moved quickly, keeping low, hoping to avoid being spotted before it was too late. The outlaws were getting bolder now. Another shot fired in her direction, narrowly missing her and sending a shower of dirt flying into the air. Clara didn't flinch. She dove behind the rocks and fired once more, the bullet finding its mark in one of the men hiding above. He tumbled off the ledge, screaming as he fell to the canyon floor below. There was no more time to waste. Clara crouched low, ducking behind another rock as she heard the sound of hooves approaching. Another group of riders had come. She could hear them getting closer, riders on horseback, ready to charge. She had to be ready. She could feel her heart racing, but her mind was calm, calculating, waiting. She only needed a few seconds, just enough time to line up the perfect shot. As the riders came into view, Clara rose from her hiding place and fired. One man dropped, then another. The third rider hesitated, but Clara was already moving, her revolver snapping up again to fire, her aim unwavering. The man barely had time to draw before he was on the ground. The canyon was growing quiet once more. Too quiet. Clara breathed deeply, her revolver still raised, her eyes scanning the distance. There were no more sounds of galloping hooves, no more echoes of approaching riders. But she knew better. The worst wasn't over yet. They were out there, waiting for the right moment, and Clara O'Donnell was ready. The canyon was deathly quiet now, the kind of silence that made Clara's skin crawl. The smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air, and the blood of her fallen enemies stained the rocks beneath her feet. Her breath was steady, but her senses were heightened. Each movement, each whisper of wind, felt like a warning. She knew this silence for what it was, a brief lull before the storm. The men she had just taken down weren't the last ones. She could feel it in her bones. Clara's gaze flicked to the narrow passage ahead, where the last of her enemies had retreated. They were regrouping, likely trying to decide whether to press on or cut their losses. But Clara knew they wouldn't give up. A man like Donovan Slade didn't stay down for long, and his men would be looking for revenge. She reached down, adjusting the grip on her revolver, and moved cautiously through the rocks. Her horse, still tethered nearby, remained still, as though waiting for Clara's next move. She had no intention of retreating, not yet. She still had business to finish, and Sagebrush was a long way behind her now. Clara's mind was focused, replaying the fight in her head. Her shots had been clean, but there was still a gnawing feeling in her chest. She'd faced worse odds, true, but the men she had just taken down were no mere bandits. They were part of something larger. Slade's gang wasn't just a collection of outlaws. They were the kind of men who had been planning this for a long time. The fact that they'd come after her, the legendary sharpshooter, meant that something more was at stake here. She knew she wouldn't get any answers if she kept running. She needed to confront them, put an end to it. Clara wasn't going to let anyone think they could walk away after crossing her. Suddenly, the sound of distant voices reached her ears. They were too far away for Clara to make out the words, but she could hear the tense tone in their voices. They were discussing something, their voices low and hurried. She crouched low behind a boulder, the shadows hiding her movements as she moved to get a better vantage point. Her eyes narrowed as she saw the men, 4 of them, emerge from the cliffs above, their rifles held firmly in their hands. Slade wasn't with them, but they were close, very close. Clara stayed still, breathing quietly, letting the shadows cloak her. She could hear the soft shuffle of their boots on the rocky ground, the jingle of their saddlebags. It was too quiet now. They were scanning the terrain, looking for her, probably assuming she'd be heading back the way they'd come. But Clara had no intentions of making herself an easy target. She had already taken down half of Slade's crew. These men wouldn't be the last. One of the men raised his hand, signaling the others to stop. They huddled close, their heads bent together as they whispered in low tones. Clara's hand tightened on the revolver, her mind calculating her next move. The wind was in her favor tonight, the way it shifted over the rocks, the direction of the sound, the shadows that would cover her movements. She could take them down one by one if she moved quickly enough. But just as she was about to make her move, a loud crack shattered the air. A shot. Clara didn't flinch. She had already expected it. They had spotted her. One of the men had taken the first shot, a clean attempt to flush her out. It missed by inches, striking a rock near her position. Clara moved instantly, her body springing into action as she darted across the canyon floor, using the terrain to her advantage. Her revolver was drawn in a flash, and she fired back, her shot ringing out in the still night. The man who had shot at her went down in a heap, his rifle falling from his hands as he collapsed, clutching his chest. The other 3 men reacted quickly, drawing their own weapons and returning fire. The first bullet whizzed past her, but Clara was already moving, her body reacting faster than her mind could process. She dove behind a rock, keeping her head low, just as the second bullet ripped through the air where she had been standing moments before. She fired again, this time taking down the second man with a clean shot to the leg. He crumpled, falling awkwardly onto the rocks as he tried to crawl to safety. Clara didn't wait for the third man to make his move. She moved quickly, her body fluid as she rushed to close the distance between them. She could hear the panicked footsteps of the last 2 men, but she was faster. Her revolver cracked again, the bullet striking the third man in the shoulder, sending him stumbling backward, his gun slipping from his hand. The last man didn't wait for the others to go down. He turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness as fast as his legs would carry him. But Clara had already seen enough. She had already taken down 3 men in the span of minutes, each one falling before they even had a chance to react. She didn't follow the last one. She didn't need to. He would be back with reinforcements, or he would find himself in another trap. Either way, he wouldn't live long enough to get far. Clara took a moment to survey the bodies at her feet. The canyon floor was littered with the outlaws she had taken down. Each of them had underestimated her. They had thought she would be easy pickings, a widow with a gun. But they had learned the hard way that Clara O'Donnell wasn't anyone's easy target. The night was still as death. The wind blew lightly, sending a few loose rocks tumbling down into the canyon. But Clara remained still, her eyes flicking to every shadow, every movement. She could feel the calm settling in, but she knew it wouldn't last. The sound of hooves had been growing in the distance. The next group of men would be here soon, and Clara wasn't finished yet. She still had work to do. Her mind was already moving ahead, calculating her next step. She wasn't done fighting. She wouldn't stop until she had taken down every last one of them, and she would make sure that none of them ever tried to cross her again. The wind had shifted again, and with it came the faint sounds of horses riding in the distance. Clara's sharp eyes scanned the horizon, calculating the distance between herself and the incoming riders. She couldn't afford to underestimate them. There was always another group, another wave of men coming to collect on her bounty, or to finish what Slade had started. She didn't have time to savor the moment of victory. The bodies of the 3 outlaws lay scattered around her, but their comrades wouldn't take kindly to the loss. It wouldn't be long before they regrouped, and this time, Clara had no intention of being caught off guard. Her senses were honed now, every muscle tensed, every nerve alert. She could feel the blood from her wound still staining her shirt, but she ignored the pain. She couldn't afford to slow down, not now. The horses were getting closer, their rhythmic pounding growing louder as they approached. Clara ducked low behind a rock, her heart racing. She could see their silhouettes in the distance now, coming into view. There were at least 4 riders, maybe more. The shadows of their figures were long, stretching out over the canyon floor, and Clara knew that the element of surprise was her only advantage. She gripped her revolver tighter. The leather of the holster creaked as her fingers slid along it, ready to draw. Her eyes never left the approaching riders. They were still a few hundred yards away, but in the blink of an eye, they'd be upon her. Clara could feel her pulse in her throat. Her entire body was in sync with the rhythm of the wind, the sound of the galloping horses. Time felt stretched, like it was holding its breath. The riders were getting closer, and Clara's hand tightened around her gun, prepared to move. But something didn't feel right. The wind had changed direction again. She hadn't heard the thud of hooves approaching from behind. A second wave? Her gut twisted. There was no time to hesitate. She had to act. Clara darted out from behind her cover, moving quickly to another set of rocks, using the terrain to keep herself hidden as she tracked the riders' movements. The first of the men came into view, riding confidently, his rifle held loosely in his hands. He wasn't expecting trouble. None of them ever did. Clara's hand shot out, her revolver drawn in a heartbeat. She fired. The first shot hit the man in the chest. He crumpled, falling from his horse with a pained gasp, and his horse whinnied as it galloped off into the distance. The second man, still riding, cursed loudly and turned his horse sharply toward the sound of the gunfire. But Clara was already on the move again. She fired 2 more shots, one hitting the second rider in the shoulder, sending him spinning off his saddle, and the other hitting the third man in the chest. Both men hit the ground hard, their bodies left sprawled across the rocky terrain, but there were still riders approaching, and the sound of more horses echoed in the distance. The last rider, a broad-shouldered man with a scar over his left cheek, didn't waste any time. He pulled his rifle to his shoulder and fired toward her position. Clara ducked behind the rocks, her heart pounding, but she didn't lose focus. She could hear the man's horse approaching, getting closer by the second. He thought he had her pinned down, but Clara wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The rider came into view, his rifle raised, but Clara was already rising to meet him. She fired again, her shot ringing out with deadly accuracy. The bullet struck the rider's hand, forcing him to drop his rifle. But he didn't fall. He was still holding onto his horse's reins with one hand, and with his other hand, he drew his revolver. Clara didn't give him a chance to fire. She shot again, and this time, the bullet struck him square in the chest, knocking him from his horse. The canyon grew silent again, but Clara wasn't finished yet. She crouched low behind the rock, her senses alert, her breath coming fast but steady. She wasn't just fighting to survive, she was fighting for control, and she would not lose control. Her eyes darted to the horizon once more. She couldn't see them yet, but she could hear the sound of more horses. Another group was coming. She had taken down the first wave, but there was always more. There was always another fight waiting for her. Clara didn't waste time contemplating her next move. She knew better than to let her guard down. She moved quickly, slipping from one cover to another, making her way toward the higher ground near the mouth of the canyon. The wind howled as she climbed the rocks, her muscles straining against the physical pain, but she ignored it. Her focus was sharp, her movements fluid, as though she had become part of the landscape. From the top of the canyon, she could see everything. The riders in the distance were drawing closer, and this time, Clara had the high ground. She'd always preferred it that way, an advantage she could exploit. Clara crouched low behind a boulder, her revolver ready. She could see the riders now, their horses kicking up dust as they galloped toward her. For men, but they were too far away to get a clear shot just yet. She had to wait. The men were almost upon her. She could feel her pulse quicken, her breath shallow. One of the men pulled ahead of the others, leading the charge. Clara's eyes locked onto him. He had a rifle, and he was trying to get into position, but Clara was faster. In one swift motion, she aimed, fired, and hit the man in the shoulder. He screamed as he fell, but Clara didn't stop. She fired again, taking down the second man, then the third. She could hear the fourth man shouting as he tried to make a break for it, but Clara's shot was already on its way, striking him in the back as he turned to flee. The canyon fell silent again, the wind howling through the jagged rocks. Clara remained still for a moment, her body tense, her breathing slow and controlled. There was no movement now, no sign of any more riders approaching. She had done it. She had cleared the canyon. But Clara knew better than to think it was over. The world of outlaws never stopped coming. There would always be another group, another fight, another reason to keep moving. But for tonight, the canyon was hers. The quiet that followed the gunfire was thick, oppressive. The wind howled in the distance, but the canyon itself felt still, almost like the desert was holding its breath. Clara stood tall in the aftermath, her revolver still drawn and steady in her hand. The 4 men she had just taken down lay scattered across the rocky floor, their bodies still, their horses grazing aimlessly nearby. Their threat was finished, but she knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. She was tired, but she wasn't ready to rest yet. Her wound, a shallow graze to her side, wasn't serious, but it would slow her down if she wasn't careful. Her pulse throbbed in her ears, but her focus never wavered. She had survived worse. She'd fought harder. But tonight, she had managed to keep control. Clara moved swiftly, the adrenaline still coursing through her. But now it was replaced by something darker, a familiar tension. She had known this would come. She'd known they wouldn't stop. Slade's men were gone, but there were more out there. And while she'd been dealing with one group, another had likely been preparing to follow her tracks. But they were too late. Her eyes scanned the canyon once more, the soft moonlight casting long shadows across the jagged rocks. The men she had just killed were reminders of the kind of world she lived in. One of violence, where there was no peace unless you made it. Where danger lurked at every turn. Where a woman had to be as fast, as deadly, as any man to survive. She holstered her revolver and took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. It was time to go. There was no reason to stick around, no reason to linger. She'd made sure her enemies were finished. The weight of the night was beginning to settle in, but Clara knew she couldn't rest for long. She was always looking over her shoulder, always aware of the fact that trouble would find its way back to her. The sound of hooves reached her ears, and Clara immediately crouched low behind a boulder, drawing her revolver once more. Her heart skipped a beat as she listened. For riders, moving in quickly. They were coming from the west, following the trail of the men she'd just killed. Had they heard the gunfire? Or had they been trailing her for longer than she realized? It didn't matter. She would handle them, like she always did. Clara had been in situations like this too many times to let panic take hold. She was calm, cold, and ready. The riders emerged from the dust, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. Clara's eyes narrowed. They weren't Slade's men. These were new faces, new dangers. But they were here for the same reason, bounty. Clara waited for the right moment, letting the riders approach, feeling the tension building in the air. They were talking to each other, laughing, unaware of her position. She could hear the leader, a stocky man with a deep voice, boast about how easy the bounty would be to claim. They were taking their time, thinking they were the ones in control. Clara wasn't going to let them have it. She stood in one smooth motion, her revolver raised and aimed. The first rider barely had time to react as Clara's bullet hit him square in the chest, dropping him from his horse with a shocked grunt. The others didn't even have time to draw their guns before Clara fired again. Another man fell, clutching his side as he hit the ground, his revolver slipping from his grasp. The two remaining riders hesitated for only a second, but that second was enough. Clara was already moving, her body in motion as she fired again. The third man dropped without a sound, his face twisted in pain as he tumbled to the ground. Only the last rider remained, but Clara didn't wait for him to flee or call for help. She fired once more, the bullet finding its mark. He stumbled back, his hand reaching for his chest as the blood seeped from the wound. He barely had time to fall before Clara was on him, her revolver still raised, making sure the job was finished. The desert was quiet once more. The canyon fell back into its haunting stillness, and the sound of hooves faded into the distance. Clara stood over the last body, her revolver still aimed at the fallen outlaw, her breath steady as she scanned the horizon. There were no more riders approaching. For now, it was just her and the desert. She holstered her revolver and wiped her brow, her fingers grazing the bullet wound at her side. The pain was dull, but it was a reminder that she was still human, still vulnerable. But she had learned long ago that survival wasn't about being invincible. It was about being ready when the world tried to take you down. Clara's gaze shifted to the setting sun, its fiery glow casting a warm, golden light over the canyon. The desert was wide, vast, and empty, but that was what made it home. The stillness had its own kind of beauty. It was the only place where Clara could find peace, even if it was fleeting. With one last look over her shoulder, Clara mounted her horse and kicked it into motion. She didn't look back as she rode into the fading light, her silhouette blending with the shadows of the canyon. The world would keep turning, and so would she. The outlaws would always be out there, but Clara O'Donnell was faster, sharper, and more ruthless than any of them. And the desert would always be hers. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow for another special story.